So tonight we're going to talk about why, without the World's Fairs, you wouldn't have Walt Disney World. And can I ask for a show of hands of how many people have been to Walt Disney World at least once? Because otherwise it won't make it's not going to be funny if you, okay. All right, I'm sorry for those of you that don't get the jokes that I have in here. Okay, so, but without the World's Fairs, we wouldn't have Walt Disney World. And this is true on a number of levels. So over the next 40 minutes, we're going to break down exactly what I mean by that. Now, if you are, oh, yes, that slide. Thank you. If you're familiar with the work of Walt Disney, you might assume that I'm talking about the 1964 World's Fair, at which Disney created 4 of the most popular attractions. And we will get there, but that's not where this story starts. Yes, okay, so that works, all right. We're gonna start in 1893 with the Chicago World's Columbian Exposition. Now the fun Disney fact about this is that Walt Disney's father, Elias, worked as a carpenter building that fair. Walt Disney himself wouldn't be born for another 8 years, which we'll see there, but the legacy of that exposition would change American culture in ways that made it ripe for Walt Disney's themed style of entertainment. Slide. Now, while Walt's story begins in Chicago, the World's Fair story starts in London with the 1853 Crystal Palace exhibition, also known as the Great Exhibition of the Works of Industry of All Nations. This was the first modern World's Fair, a new mix of existing industry fairs and art exhibitions set up largely to impress the world with the greatness of the host nation, in this case, Great Britain, and to advertise consumer products. The concept became enormously popular, with 60 fairs taking place between 1851 and 1915 alone, which is a pretty crazy amount. Almost 1 per year. And they took place all over the world. The first fair on US soil was the New York Crystal Palace exhibition of 1853, which was largely disappointing to sponsors and to visitors alike. And largely because of that, and because of the Civil War, we wouldn't host another exhibition until 1876, the Philadelphia Centennial International Exhibition, which fared slightly better. Over the next few years, we had several more, but the most successful, most well-remembered would be the Chicago World's Columbian Exposition of 1893. Now, it's here that we're going to pick up the Disney story by looking at ways in which the World's Fairs created a culture that paved the way for theme parks and for Epcot specifically. Now, Epcot, in case you aren't familiar, but I'm guessing many of you are, is a theme park at Walt Disney World that is divided into 2 main sections. World Showcase and Future World, or at least it was until a recent reimagining, but I'm going to keep calling it Future World for the point of this talk. Now, in the broadest sense, Epcot is a permanent World's Fair. Right? There's a cultural section that is intended to showcase the best of a bunch of different places, and a section that highlights new technologies and how they will contribute to better living, with a tendency towards privileging America and most of its accolades. And while the company-sanctioned story about exactly how this layout was created for Epcot involves executives pushing together 2 models for distinct parks when they couldn't get either one fully funded on their own, the park sections very much reflect their World's Fair heritage. Now, you're looking at a map of the 1893 exposition, and we can split it into roughly 3 sections. So we have arts and culture, amusement, and science and industry. Epcot boasts a rather similar layout. But beyond the basic mapping and layout of Epcot, World's Fairs gave rise to several of the factors that allowed themed places like Disneyland and Disney World to thrive. The World's Fairs walked so that theme parks could run, if you will. Now, early amusements rides tended to focus on the action of the visitor, physically moving the visitor through space. Examples of this include, and I'm sorry, this is a lot of clicking, merry-go-rounds, which at first were powered by mules or horses, the Ferris wheel, which debuted at the 1893 exposition, switchback railways, essentially gravity-powered roller coasters. You're gonna wanna click like 4 times. Yeah, okay. And my personal favorite, the Bowls of Joy, which debuted at the 1915 San Francisco Fair. Yeah, there it is. Now just wait for it. This was considered the first launched roller coaster, where cars accelerated out through one bowl and shot out the side and across the track into the other bowl and then hoped to decelerate down. Now, this only resulted in 2 deaths and a handful of injuries, which I think is actually pretty good. Now, calmer attractions in which the visitor walked through scenes that told a story or evoked emotion got their start in ancient art exhibitions and pleasure gardens. Walk-through wax museums with historical or titillating scenes had existed since the late 1700s, Madame Tussauds being the most famous. And these attractions, like the amusement ride, were present at World's Fairs. And one of my favorites is this tableau of the Greeley expedition, which was at the 1893 fair. Yes. This scene was described by visitors as incredibly lifelike, with faux ice and snow around taxidermied animals and human figures. The beauty of the scene is somewhat marred for me by the realization that guests would probably get from the exhibit that my institution put on a few feet away, that only 7 of the original 25-man team survived, what ended up being 2 years in the Arctic without provisions, and in fact that they are most often remembered for possibly resorting to cannibalism. Now, that aside, it was World's Fairs that first combined the idea of a mechanical ride that physically moves the visitor with a narrative story, creating the types of themed entertainment attractions that Disney's known for today. The first of these are the now familiar dark rides, which take the visitor indoors to travel through a built scene. This, the Hereafter, is the most popular ride at the 1904 St. Louis Fair. It had visitors journeying through hell, as depicted by figures and new rear projection illusion technology, like the Pepper's Ghost that Disney still uses today. The guests moved through an entire story, not just through space. Viewing the cafe in hell, where apparently you could see your food but not eat it, and order a beer but not drink it, before taking an elevator to the true afterlife, where you boarded a boat to ride through figures depicting Dante's punishments, were directly confronted by Satan and human actors to terrify you along the way. It was maybe not the most fun ride, but it was a narrative ride nonetheless. And if you've been to Disneyland, or had been to Disneyland a while ago, you would know that Mr. Toad's Wild Ride at Disneyland also took the visitor through a version of hell, so maybe it is more fun than I think. That same fair boasted a creation ride, to counter the Hereafter, an attraction in which guests could simulate a ride on a Siberian railway, one where they could watch a reenactment of the Boer War, and one where they could stand in a hurricane and witness its devastating aftermath in the Galveston flood. This is the end of the Victorian era, so perhaps it's the seeming obsession with tragedy is like timely, right? But the World's Fairs are responsible for also creating spaces in which cultural performance and material consumption were considered leisure activities and entertainment. Between the 17th and 19th centuries, among wealthy Europeans, there was a notion that to be well-rounded, one should undertake a grand tour, a cultural and semi-religious pilgrimage around Europe that could last from several months to several years. Today, it is a television show that still depicts wealthy Brits traveling around the world. But then as now, the working class could neither afford the cost of the travel nor the time off from work to do such a thing. What they could afford, generally, was the token that it cost to enter a fair or exposition. In that sense, the World's Fairs helped to democratize cultural experiences. At the fair, anyone could travel around the world in a day, seeing whatever participating countries cared to highlight about themselves, or what purported ethnologists wanted to display from their own studies. This had a lot of racial and colonial implications, as only those countries that had disposable funds were able to curate their own displays, which is not unlike how Epcot ended up with the countries that it has today in World Showcase. Also, the fair organizers and ethnologists responsible for representing other cultures could do so in whatever ways played to their own ends, both for good and for ill. And so there were definitely downsides to this, right? The exotization of the other, representations of some cultures as savage and some are civilized, et cetera, et cetera. But at its best, these spaces allowed visitors of all classes to learn about other cultures and glimpse a world beyond their own. But unlike the Grand Tour, this was a very quick visit to a recreated display of a time and a place, part of what we now consider to be theme design. But it wasn't just recreated architecture. Often individuals or groups from the places represented would come to live in these recreated spaces, like this Javanese family, which we'll see in a second. At the 1893 fair in particular, there were official national pavilions, as well as villages in which native peoples purported to live and show their way of life. Now, in the White City, these villages were along the midway, the amusement section of the fair. Ride the Ferris wheel, then stroll through a Samoan village. Now, I would again be remiss to not point out that the viewing of cultures and people simply existing in ways different than oneself as pure entertainment can lead down some dark roads of comparison. We can see this in the index to the map of the White City, where, as I mentioned, the national pavilions, which were mostly for Western European countries, were placed in the section relating to art and culture, as well as on the midway, while Asian and African countries were solely exhibited on the midway, billed mainly as amusement. But purely from the perspective of what this does for theme parks, we begin to see the removal of the barrier seeing cultures as something belonging in a museum, and instead as something to be experienced. Culture is something that all classes can partake in, not just the elite. Places like Epcot and Animal Kingdom flow directly from this, right? Their non-American spaces are recreated and staffed with individuals from the spaces in question for purposes both of entertainment and of education. And also, the 1893 Midway is where you could find Little Egypt doing the hoochie coochie, as referenced in Disney's Carousel of Progress. Something else that World's Fairs did was turn consumption into entertainment, particularly in America. The puritanical roots of America meant that early American character and values were generally associated with thrift and making do with less. Right? As the world economy shifted into the industrial age and there was an emphasis on production, it became necessary to create an equal and opposite market for those produced goods. World's Fairs became massive marketing blitzes for gadgets to make your life better. Exhibits of well-appointed parlors and living rooms showed guests an aspirational way of living, and fair marketing in goods extended beyond the fairs themselves, with illustrated souvenir publications making their way across the country, being read in living rooms by those who had never even been close to the fair. The World's Fairs normalized the idea that an outing meant for amusement could and should include consumption, both at the event and beyond. What you're looking at here is possibly the apex of that trend, the House of Tomorrow, designed by George Fred Keck for the 33 World's Fair, where 12 homes of varying types were built to show man's modern innovations in technology. The kitchen here includes a General Electric dishwasher and refrigerator, as well as a Sunbeam Mixmaster, you might notice. Oh dear. Now, in addition to such product placement, corporations would sponsor pavilions so that their name would be associated with your experience. And in this photograph from 1893, you're looking at the General Electric Pavilion, which showcased Thomas Edison's work and was covered in a thrilling display of electric light bulbs, the likes of which many people visiting the fair had not yet seen. Now, I'm not here to tell you whether I think this is a good thing or a bad thing, but what I can say is that it lays the groundwork for theme parks in which visiting gift shops and purchasing special experiences is seen as the norm. It's part of the expected amusement. This goes hand in hand with branding at theme parks. We don't find it jarring today that Test Track is sponsored by General Motors, in part because every pavilion at the World's Fair had either a nation or a corporation as its backer, putting up the funds so that the visitor could be amused and conditioning us to accept that as standard practice. The final through line that we're going to touch on here is that World's Fairs acted as communal spaces for entire nations, places that invited the world into a carefully curated vision of how a nation wanted to be seen. They also inspired pride in the host countries and acted as rallying points for the dissemination and creation of national identity. They act as places of comfort for a nation, where people can go to strengthen their faith in their country, particularly in times of national anxiety. I wrote a book about this, which I will happily expound on if you ever see me outside of this classroom. And by now you're going, what about 1964? I thought that was the big reason we were here tonight. And it is, and we're getting there. But it is important to note that 1964 isn't the beginning of Disney's World's Fair relationship, but rather it's a continuation in a line through history that goes from early art exhibitions to the Crystal Palace to Walt Disney World. Right? And speaking of Walt Disney World, Disneyland opened in 1955 in Anaheim, California. It's an instant success, incorporating a lot of the themes of World's Fairs that we just discussed: narrative story rides, new technologies, consumption as entertainment, and it certainly served as a place of comfort for anxious Americans during the Cold War. But very quickly, Walt Disney realized he had made one big mistake. He didn't acquire enough land to fully control the visitor experience. He knew he wanted to build something more, something bigger, maybe something more towards the middle of the country or even on the East Coast. One of the problems was that some people didn't believe a Disneyland-style idea would succeed on the East Coast. The Eastern audience was considered more sophisticated than that of the West Coast because it was where the nation's capital concentrated decision makers and influencers of power. It's where the country's oldest universities resided. These people went to the Met. They didn't go to the Golden Horseshoe, right? So when nationwide planning began for the '64 fair, Walt saw a twofold opportunity. First, to get his type of entertainment in front of an Eastern audience and test its reception, and secondly, to get corporate sponsors to pay for work he already wanted done at Disneyland. Now, in the end, Disney presented 4 major attractions at the fair: the Great Moments for Mr. Lincoln for the state of Illinois, the Carousel of Progress for General Electric, Magic Skyway for Ford, and It's a Small World for Pepsi-Cola and UNICEF. Ultimately, Disney's presence at that fair gave us 3 big things that greatly influenced Walt Disney World: human figure audio animatronics, increased ride capacities, and an overall belief in the concept of an East Coast Disneyland. I will also note, for me personally, that it gave us the earworm that is It's a Small World, which contributed greatly to my life, as it was the only song that would call my daughter when she was an infant. So I appreciate the Sherman Brothers. Now, as noted at the top of this talk, Walt Disney's familiarity with World's Fairs began way before 1964. He personally visited several over his lifetime, including the 1939 Golden Gate International Exposition in San Francisco, where he premiered the short Mickey Surprise Party, which is what you're seeing here. And while he was there, he saw the miniature rooms of artist Narcissa Thorne, which appealed to his innate storytelling desire for world building. He starts collecting miniatures, then he starts building miniatures, then he begins incorporating miniatures into the trains that he already enjoyed doing. You can see that, here we go, I'm gonna use the pointer, on the upper right, so these are nice small trees. Here he's experimenting with building scenes with movement, much like the rides that go through a narrated scene. This evolved into the idea for a traveling show of miniature American scenes, which would be called Disneylandia. In the photos on the left here, Walt's showing off the scenes of a log cabin. And in another small scene called Project Little Man, Walt and his team attempted a miniature dancing figure. Now, Walt personally worked on this idea for several years until eventually it merged with some other grand ideas to become Disneyland. He still wanted scenes with moving figures, but he wanted them really big. So Disneyland had moving figures, right, along the train route and on the Jungle Cruise in particular, but their movements were very limited and they weren't synchronized with any sound. After seeing a mechanical toy bird that sang, this bird on the left, in fact, Walt, the man who had synchronized sound to cartoon, determined to synchronize sound to movement. He sent his Imagineers to building figures that would do just that. They started with birds, which eventually became the Enchanted Tiki Room, which many of you have probably already visited. And then they scaled up to working on humans, starting with a Confucius-type figure for a possible Asian restaurant, who you can see in the bottom left corner. Walt wanted the figure to dispense wisdom to guests in the lobby, but quickly pivoted the project instead to bring to life one of his heroes, Abraham Lincoln. Walt was essentially envisioning the Hall of Presidents at this time, but he had to start somewhere in order to pitch that idea, so Lincoln was it. Now, technically, engineering-wise, this was very difficult, and I don't really understand any of that. But I did an oral history with Bob Gurr, who is the Imagineer who is credited with getting this figure kind of over the finish line. And he was talking about airplane fuselages and steel tubing, and I was like, I don't get it. But what I do understand is that it took a lot of work, a lot of time, and a lot of expense to build a believable human figure, all of which were valuable commodities to a company that was already stretched pretty thin. Now, during this time, Walt was also overseeing the first Disney-made attraction for a World's Fair, the cyclorama film America the Beautiful, which was for the Ford Motor Company, premiered at the 1958 Brussels World's Fair. So when the plans for the '64 fair were announced, he had an idea for how to fund his Lincoln figure and more. 3 of Disney's World's Fair pavilions ended up using what we know today as audio animatronic technology, which debuted for the very first time at the fair thanks to the influx of capital and the time crunch of an opening day deadline. And though they happened in rapid succession, each pushed the technology a little bit further. In the 60s, Disney entered into an agreement with Ford to create their pavilion, which would be the Magic Skyway. The concept had guests riding on Ford cars on a voyage through time and space, from a dark and distant yesterday to a bright and promising tomorrow. And in that dark and distant yesterday, Disney wanted to depict the first use of the wheel by cavemen. The cavemen didn't need to speak exactly, so as Bob Gurr said, you know, Neanderthal cavemen, they're corny looking anyway, and if they move in a corny manner, it's perfectly fine. And indeed, they really do.
New creature stands before the challenge of the universe, man. Homo sapiens, thinking man. His skills as a hunter and toolmaker trapped the mighty mammoth and gave his world its name, the Stone Age. Never were the exploits of primitive man depicted with such realism or such good humor as through Walt Disney's marvelous new technique, audio animatronics.
You can move on. It's corny, but it's still a fully human moving figure. But the next pavilion they had in mind needed more. In the late 1950s, Walt was planning 2 potential expansions to Disneyland. You'll note that this map is not actually accurate because these things didn't happen. He was thinking about Liberty Street, which would showcase American and Revolutionary history, and Edison Square, where the history of electricity and technological progress would be explored. And it was for those expansions that Walt had first started his Imagineers on the task of building realistic audio animatronics. When they started working on the fair, however, GE and Disney decided to pivot and focus their resources on Progress Land, a theater that would rotate guests through time, showing all of the progress that electricity had brought us. Today, we know this as the Carousel of Progress, a rotating theater that houses scenes of one family through American history. It was to be a perpetual stage show in which the performers never needed a break. And with that directive, a hard opening date of 1964, and a hefty fee from General Electric, Imagineers devoted their time to bringing the extant technology up to task. The show ultimately had 32 human performers, not to mention the family dog and cat. Unlike the Skyway cavemen, these characters needed to read clearly as Homo sapiens. They needed to be taken seriously by the viewer. These are the characters that would really start to propel audio animatronic technology forward along with Lincoln. And as you will see in the next clip, they are more believable than the cavemen, but their movements are still rather confined and small.
There's a great big beautiful tomorrow shining at the end of every day. There's a great big beautiful tomorrow, and tomorrow's just a dream away. Man has a dream, and that's the start. He follows his dream with mind and heart. When it becomes a reality, it's a dream come true forever waiting. So there's a great big beautiful tomorrow shining at the end of every day. There's a great big beautiful tomorrow, just a dream away.
That was great. Very catchy. But for Lincoln, Walt really wanted like a reincarnation. right? He wanted everything to be the best that it could be, to be true to the vision that he saw in his mind's eye, except that in the case of Lincoln, the man was more than just a vision, right? He actually existed. He was well known. There were photographs. So Walt pushed the Imagineers for even more realism. Now, by 1961, the figure they had already been working on could stand up from his chair, which was a feat in itself, and something that you didn't see with the Carousel of Progress figures. But he wasn't quite hitting the mark for Walt, who had worked with a leading Lincoln historian to try and understand how the man moved and spoke when he was delivering a speech. All the Carousel of Progress figures had to do was smile and repeat a few lines to deliver a satisfactory performance, but Lincoln really had to emote. And with only a few months left before the fair's opening, Walt told Bob Gurr that he wanted him to double the number of movements that the figure was capable of. And so he did.
The world has never had a good definition of the word liberty. The American people.
You can go ahead, you get the gist, right? The Lincoln figure was so lifelike that fair guests were convinced that he was an actor. And the booth adjacent to the one for Illinois was for a manufacturing company who were giving away samples of what they made, which were metal ball bearings. And guests were so convinced that Lincoln was real that they would throw the ball bearings at him, trying to get him to flinch. And the techs going in to service the figure every night had to clean them up before they could work, lest they slip and break their necks. Let's see, I think we need to do two. Yep, there's Walt. Yeah. Okay. All these figures are the foundation for the fantastic audio animatronics we see at Disney parks today, which of course are much more advanced than a lot of these. But without the influx of cash and the pressure of a condensed time period, they would probably not exist. The World's Fair pushed audio animatronic technology through a period of such rapid growth that otherwise would have taken decades, that it simply would not be possible to be where we are today. Now, ride capacities also experienced rapid growth during the World's Fair. At the time, Disneyland was welcoming 4 or 5 million visitors a year. The World's Fair was anticipating as many as 35 million a year. Until the early 1960s, Disney simply hadn't designed their parks or their rides to truly handle those massive crowds. Now, I probably don't need to tell you that It's a Small World is an old mill-style boat ride. It sails through scenes of dolls of different cultures, all singing from the same song sheet. The original boats could hold about 20 people, and each section of the Progress Land Theater that we just saw could hold about 240. Since both rides were moving on a continuous loop, their hourly capacity was about 3,000 people each. Now, for reference, the Mark Twain riverboat at Disneyland, the biggest ride, could carry, if everyone squeezed together, about 400 passengers at a time. It had 15-minute trip cycles, so its hourly throughput was only 1,600 guests. So both It's a Small World and the Carousel of Progress nearly doubled potential ride capacity. And this development would aid Disney as they developed larger parks, such as Walt Disney World, and as they tried to increase capacity within the extant footprint of Disneyland, which today has close to 30 million visitors every year. And the success of the Small World ride system in particular influenced Walt and Imagineers, who had originally been planning for attractions such as the Pirates of the Caribbean and the Haunted Mansion to be walkthroughs, which sounds lame today, since they already had a boat ride at the park with the Jungle Cruise, and would presumably be adding another if they moved It's a Small World over to Disneyland. They were convinced by the ease of moving so many people through an attraction without compromising the experience that they made both of those ride-through attractions instead of walkthroughs, which I appreciate today. Because there were so many large crowds, Disney learned a lot about crowd management around these increased capacity rides. Even though they could hold more people, the attractions were so popular that they were causing massive lines around and outside their pavilions. So for the second season of the fair in 1965, Disney instituted the now very familiar switchback line, which allowed them to neatly manage people in a small space in an orderly way. They also added an estimated wait time, at the queue entrance for Carousel of Progress, as well as a covered outdoor queue, all of which are innovations I am particularly grateful for today as a theme park visitor. Lastly, the massive crowds queuing for all 4 of Walt Disney World's fair attractions were all the affirmation that he needed to begin more aggressively pursuing his East Coast park. While he'd already been toying with the idea and had even commissioned studies to find the right location, until the fair, most outsiders didn't share Walt's consummate belief in his vision for a bigger Disneyland, and they hadn't even heard about his original idea for Epcot yet. But the fair made it clear to everyone that a Disneyland-style attraction would play even in the apparently snobbish air of the East Coast. The fair also made it clear to Walt himself that he could play a role in bridging the gap between new technologies and the public. In his own pavilions at the fair and in those he visited, he saw brand new gadgets being demonstrated, often the public's first introduction to these concepts. Years before you could have them in your own home, much less carry them in your pocket, fair visitors got to see color televisions and a picture phone. They got to enter the first public buildings to have air conditioning in the United States at the Texas Centennial Exposition of 1936. They got to peek into the future. The fair would only fuel Walt's desire to create Epcot as a real community in which all of the technological advances he saw at the fair could be used and tested in a real setting. That wouldn't come to be for various reasons, but the fair was part of a direct historical line to the Epcot that we know today. So, the next time you're at Walt Disney World, thanking the Phoenicians for learning your ABCs, remember to also tip your hat to World's Fairs. You wouldn't be here without them. Thank you.
We're going to open up for Q&A, and I have a microphone, so if anyone has any questions, I'll come around.
And a hand to Susanna for being a great automated clicker. Thank you. Appreciate it. I was going to say, no, they loved it. They're ready to go. That's, yeah.
Coming around.
Hi. My question would be, do you think that the inspiration that you found, this correlation between the fairs and Disney, was mainly in the mind of Walt Disney, or do you have like some references of other people in the company that thought the same way?
Yeah, no, I think that it was more of a cultural milieu in which they were all sort of steeped at the time. And Walt did take several members of his team to different fairs. And they all, of course, because it was sort of the thing to do growing up, would have probably been to one if they had the ability to go to one. So I absolutely think, though, we attribute a lot of it to Walt Disney, that it was definitely something that was a lot more collaborative and came from all of them.
So just thinking about the future, is there any future for World's Fairs, or if not, is there going to be another different evolution of theme parks?
So I was just talking with Frank, the archivist, I don't know your actual title, Frank, I'm sorry, but the archivist here at the Smithsonian today about this question, right? Are we going to keep having World's Fairs? And we were talking about how they really functioned as these sort of nation-making moments, these identity-forming touchstones for countries and peoples. And how, we don't think that they could have the same impact today because of our advanced technologies, right? What can you show me at a World's Fair that I haven't already seen, on my computer or on my phone? But the book that I mentioned, I spent a lot of time arguing that, in fact, theme parks, specifically Walt Disney World and Disneyland, today fulfill that function for the United States, that they act as a place where we go to see the best of ourselves, or what we hope to be, and that we renew our sense of community in places like that. For now, I don't know that. I know there's another theme park going up in the middle of the country that I think wants to have that. I think it's called like America Land or something. That wants to have that impact. I don't know that a place because the Disney company has a 100-year history and because of various factors in the work that they did, which sort of attached them to the American identity from the very beginning. I don't think a new theme park coming along could have that same gravitas and influence on America. But I guess, I could be wrong.
Have you thought about how theme parks might change, say, 10 or 15 years from now from what they are now?
Besides technologically, the technological stuff is a given, right? That if they're going to keep getting fancier and involve more VR technologies. I'm not a scientist, so I can't speak to that. What I have seen happen, particularly with the Disney theme parks, is people returning to them in times of crisis. So after the oil crisis of 1970, visitation at Walt Disney World actually goes up instead of people staying home. Right after COVID, people felt safe going back to places like Disney when they didn't feel safe going to other places. So I think as long as the company can negotiate representing a country that has so many different peoples and ideas and ideals, which I think becomes increasingly difficult for them, they will remain culturally relevant without having to change in that sense.
So I grew up going to like amusement parks on the beach, and when my understanding of Disney World or Disneyland was just that they were bigger, fancier, more expensive amusement parks than the ones that I was used to, and I'm wondering, whether Disney saw his parks partly as an evolution of those amusement parks, or else maybe he was trying to get away from the connotations that those parks had of being at least slightly disreputable places.
Yeah, so the sort of company story that Disney will tell is that he was at Griffith Park wanting to ride the carousel with his daughters, and he wanted to create a place where families could do these kinds of rides together. That's certainly partially true. He thought that theme parks in general were pretty seedy places to be, right? That's also true. He also was so into world building and wanting to take you into a story that he wanted a place that would take you somewhere else, right? And not just amuse you. So from the get-go, he didn't envision this as an amusement park. And in fact, the term theme park is coined for Disneyland, for Walt Disney World. It really is the first theme park because it was started and designed from one end to the other to create a full experience, right? Not to be I'm gonna go ride this, and then I'm gonna get popcorn, and then I'm gonna throw up, right? You leave here understanding a full story. So he would definitely tell you, not amusement park, don't you dare say that to me. But also, he really started an entire industry just by creating the Disneyland.
Was it critical for Disney to have the hotels, the accommodations inside the park? So my sense is that you had a feeling that you were part of it and not just visiting for the day.
Yeah, so part of why Walt wanted to build Disney World was to incorporate the entirety of your experience into a way that he could control, right? And that sounds like really bad, but in the sense that he wanted to make sure that every part of your experience was up to his standards. And he realized after he built Disneyland that as soon as you stepped out of the gate, you were assaulted by whatever the town of Anaheim was doing at that moment, whether Walt liked it or not. And in fact, that you could see, right, parts of Anaheim from parts of Disneyland, which he was particularly displeased with. And so that's why he starts his search for a massive amount of land where he can control your experience from the moment you enter until the moment you leave.
Back in the early 60s, just before the World's Fair in New York, there was a park, a theme park called Freedom Land. And it was to recreate the history of the U.S. And I think it lasted a year or two, and for a while it was good. They brought in acts, you know, singers and stuff. But for some reason it bombed out after about 2 years. But it was, they went to quite a lot to try to promote it, but just, I guess history in the Bronx just didn't fly.
Yeah. Well, I can tell you why. So there's like 5 reasons that I give for why Disney ended up being what Freedom Land probably wanted to be, right? The first is that by the time they built a theme park, they already had this reputation as speaking for America because of the types of animation and film that they did, which usually retold American folktales. Because Mickey Mouse had already sort of been identified as the underdog American spirit, and because during World War II, they were both officially and unofficially associated with the government, associated with the United States. By 1955, Uncle Walt was the American dream, right? From 1955 on, you get also this association with the federal government, in a sense that every president, with the exception of Lyndon Johnson and Donald Trump, has been to a Disney park at some point in their political lifetime, which gives this seal of approval, right, official approval to the story, and is also good PR for everybody, right, who's involved. And the third, or I don't know what number I'm on, the last kind of important part of that too is that Disney doesn't just depict straight history. It allows the stories to change in ways that the public wants to see. So, you know, I don't know what their research arm is, but I'm sure that they put a massive amount of money into understanding where the culture is going, right? And so rides like the Carousel of Progress change over time to depict different family roles, different roles of women, and it's not a sort of forward march of progress, right? It's really attuned to what is happening at the moment. So in the 70s, when you really start to see the rise of feminism, it becomes a little more liberal, that show. In the 80s, when you see the backlash to that, it gets a little bit more conservative. So Disney's constantly making these little tweaks that keep them relevant to new generations.
So I've got a question regarding Walt. Wanting to be taken seriously, not as a mere animator, but as a futurist. And I'm wondering his original plans for Disney World and Epcot as less entertainment and more as creating the city and town of the future. And I'm wondering if you could talk about his idea of creating a sort of idealistic model kind of town or city for America.
Yeah, so Walt's original, Epcot stands for Experimental Prototype Community of Tomorrow, which is exactly what Walt wanted it to be, right? He acquiesced to building a castle park that we know as Magic Kingdom in Florida to fund Epcot, which he saw as a place where people would come, they would sign a contract to live there for a year or so, and they would live in the newest technologies that were not even sold yet. He had partnerships with different corporations, so it would be a little experimental place, right? He believed heavily in changing public transportation, right? He was annoyed with all the cars that were on the street in LA, and people still say when they go to Disney that one of the things they like best is that it's easy to get from one place to another, right? So in that sense, he succeeded. He dies, of course, before that vision can be completed. And I personally think that he might have had the charisma to pull it off, but no one else in the company did, because it turns out that you have to let people vote on things, and the company didn't really want anyone to do that. And no one really wanted to live and let 100 people into their kitchen to see their new Sunbeam Mix Master, right, every day. So they compromised on that. But he really did have this vision that he was going to change the world. And if he had lived another 20, 40 years, I think he very well would have.
everything seems to have a certain lifespan of relevance. And, Barnum and Bailey Circus forever, for instance. Do you see that Disneyland will lose its relevance at some point because of the way children are now learning, the quickness of the AI, the quickness, the change of technology? Do you think it will fade out, or is it going to stay strong like the World's Fair has, I haven't heard about it?
I think that it's going to stay strong because Disney is such a part of the fabric of who Americans think that they are, that we're currently still, we teach our children, essentially, to recognize Disney, if not to love it, right? To know what it has to say. And it's still, to a point, the last statistics that I saw said anywhere between 83 and 92% of Americans still go to a Disney park at some point in their lifetime. And some of them go begrudgingly, but they still see it as this mark of being an American. Yeah. And I think if the company, if they make choices that are out of step with the country and where it's going, that it's possible that, they would start to fade in relevance. But so far they seem to be able to, navigate that, and we're still showing our children movies from the 50s.
I'm going to go backwards instead of where it's going, but where it came from. I'm an art history buff, and I can't help but think of the idea of engineering and experience and equate it to the building of the great cathedrals from, the Merovingian age all the way through the Middle Ages. And, there's nothing new about anchoring a country's culture in an experiential location. And I would argue even the cave paintings in Lascaux, well, people are still trying to figure out why they were made, their exact function. It probably served exactly the same function that you described.
Yeah, to pass down
which is
something.
culture making and
Yeah.
anchoring a culture in a repeated and passed along story. So there's nothing new about it conceptually. The scale of it is, I'm sure when the cathedrals went up, the scale of it was stunning at the time.
Right.
And this is a modern extension of scale of culture anchoring in a larger sense. So I'm thinking more from this dialogue about where it came from more than where it's going. And in that, I would answer the previous guy that it either it evolves or it will be replaced, but there'll always be, a magic place that has pilgrimage
Yes.
type attraction
Absolutely.
for a culture.
Yeah, and I would certainly,
It's part of the long history of the human race,
right, we always find places to pilgrimage to, right?
I wanted to add, what is the role of Disneyland Paris, other than obviously cultural exports, but how did that work out? And
Yeah, so the Disneyland Paris is interesting because I would say that it's almost more stereotypically American than what we have today, because the companies that invested in Disneyland Paris and Tokyo and Hong Kong, when the Disney company said to them, "We want to represent you," they said, no, you represent America, right? And we want you to essentially build exactly what you have at Disneyland over here. But what they haven't had to do there is change with the way that Americans see themselves, because they're not talking to Americans, right? So in Disneyland Paris, they still have a Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, which I think would really not fly here. But is seen as quintessentially American. So they kind of took divergent paths, I think, in the past.
Were there any attractions that just turned out to be a big mistake, and they 6 months later, they got rid of it or whatever?
I think given the amount of investment that they've put into things, they haven't ever to my knowledge, they haven't scrapped anything within the 6 months. They have definitely made huge changes. One of the things that Disneyland, when they opened, they had like a circus for a while, and then it turned out you didn't go to Disneyland to go to a circus, right? So that didn't last very long.
Can you comment on the community planning philosophy around Disney, the celebration, the town of celebration, and where that might go in the future?
I'm not like a super expert on celebration, but really he's just following planning that already has happened, right? So he's following the gentleman, I can't remember who planned Columbia, the city of Columbia in Maryland, which is near where I live, fun fact. And he's copying others who believe that they can lay out cities in ways that make more sense, right? That make it easier to live. I think he would be today taken more seriously as a city planner and a visionary if the Disney name had not become so attached to things of fantasy and had not gone through a period of sort of denigration by different like academics and things like that. I think they would take him more seriously as a city planner.
Hi. I love that you found that connection between Disney's father, that he worked at the fair. Were you able to find in your research anything where actually he says that inspired him to build Disney World in any way?
He never, to my knowledge, talked about it specifically. There's a lot of, in biographies of him, there's a lot of people saying, well, I'm sure that, Elias would have told him about, working on the fair, and maybe he would, maybe he wouldn't have. I think just the fact that he would have grown up going to them, and, when you go, I'm sure Elias would be like, I built that one, but no, he doesn't sort of claim it as part of his inspiration.
And kind of as a follow-up question, I mean, you mentioned he was a carpenter, no?
Mm-hmm.
Disney's father. So, do you think that he was inspired with the manual skills or whatever into building all this stuff? That it wasn't because really, he emerges to be known as a filmmaker, no, a movie maker, mm-hmm. And this comes later, I think, in his career. Don't correct me if I'm wrong, but I wonder if that's something that also draw him into trying to create these things, challenge the robots, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I mean, I think it certainly could. I think he spent his childhood trying to separate himself from that, right? And I think we all know that as you get older, you sort of appreciate the things that your parents did or do a little more. So it's certainly possible. He never really claimed that. He would probably have linked it more towards his interest in trains and automatons, which he linked to growing up where he did in Marceline. But I mean, I think it's certainly possible.
Just another one. Do you think that the Kennedy Space Center grew into feeding off from Disney World?
Yeah, I think pretty much everything around Orlando in Florida is a direct result of Disney World. Yeah.
Any final questions? Okay. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, Bethanee.